Jeremy looked across the table at Arabella and still couldn't believe she had agreed to be his wife. He was the luckiest man in the world. She was giving him the shy smile that had so entranced him the first time they met, when a waiter appeared by his side. "I'll have an espresso," said Jeremy. "And my fiancée," it still sounded strange to him, "will have a mint tea." "Very good, sir." Jeremy tried to stop himself looking around the room, full of at-home people who knew exactly where they were and what was expected of them, whereas he had never visited the Ritz before. It became clear from the waves and blown kisses from customers who flitted in and out of the morning room that Arabella knew everyone, from the maitre d' to several of the set, as she often referred to them. Jeremy sat back and tried to relax. They'd first met at Ascot. Arabella was inside the royal enclosure looking out, while Jeremy was on the outside looking in. That was how he'd assumed it would always be, until she gave him that beguiling smile as she strolled out of the enclosure and whispered as she passed him, "Put your shirt on, trumpeter." Then she disappeared off in the direction of the private boxes. Jeremy took her advice and placed £20 on trumpeter, double his usual wager, before returning to the stands to see the horse romp home at 5-1. He hurried back to the royal enclosure to thank her, at the same time hoping she might give him another tip for the next race, but she was nowhere to be seen. He was disappointed, but still placed £50 of his winnings on a horse the Daily Express tipster fancied. It turned out to be a nag that would be described in tomorrow's paper as an also-ran. Jeremy returned to the royal enclosure for a third time in the hope of seeing her again. He searched the paddock full of elegant men dressed in morning suits with little enclosure badges hanging from their lapels, all looking exactly like each other. They were accompanied by wives and girlfriends adorned in designer dresses and outrageous hats, desperately trying not to look like anyone else. Then he spotted her, standing next to a tall, aristocratic-looking man who was bending down and listening intently to a jockey dressed in red and yellow hooped silks. She didn't appear to be interested in their conversation and began to look around. Her eyes settled on Jeremy, and he received that same friendly smile once again. She whispered something to the tall man, then walked across the enclosure to join him at the railing. "I hope you took my advice," she said. "Sure did," said Jeremy. "But how could you be so confident?" "It's my father's horse." "Should I back your father's horse in the next race?" "Certainly not. You should never bet on anything unless you're sure it's a certainty." "I hope you won enough to take me to dinner tonight." If Jeremy didn't reply immediately, it was only because he couldn't believe he'd heard her correctly. He eventually stammered out, "Where would you like to go?" "The Ivy, 8 o'clock. By the way, my name's Arabella Warwick." Without another word, she turned on her heel and went back to join her set. Jeremy was surprised Arabella had given him a second look, let alone suggested they should dine together that evening. He expected that nothing would come of it, but as she'd already paid for dinner, he had nothing to lose. Arabella arrived a few minutes after the appointed hour, and when she entered the restaurant, several pairs of male eyes followed her progress as she made her way to Jeremy's table. He had been told they were fully booked until he mentioned her name. Jeremy rose from his place long before she joined him. She took the seat opposite him as a waiter appeared by her side. "The usual, madam?" She nodded, but didn't take her eyes off Jeremy. By the time her Bellini had arrived, Jeremy had begun to relax a little. She listened intently to everything he had to say, laughed at his jokes, and even seemed to be interested in his work at the bank. Well, he had slightly exaggerated his position and the size of the deals he was working on. After dinner, which was a little more expensive than he'd anticipated, he drove her back to her home in Pavilion Road and was surprised when she invited him in for coffee, and even more surprised when they ended up in bed. Jeremy had never slept with a woman on a first date before. He could only assume that it was what the set did, and when he left the next morning, he certainly didn't expect ever to hear from her again. But she called that afternoon and invited him over for supper at her place. From that moment, they hardly spent a day apart during the next month. What pleased Jeremy most was that Arabella didn't seem to mind that he couldn't afford to take her to her usual haunts, and appeared quite happy to share a Chinese or Indian meal when they went out for dinner, often insisting that they split the bill. But he didn't believe it could last, until one night she said, "You do realize I'm in love with you, don't you, Jeremy?" Jeremy had never expressed his true feelings for Arabella. He'd assumed their relationship was nothing more than what her set would describe as a fling. Not that she'd ever introduced him to anyone from her set. When he fell on one knee and proposed to her on the dance floor at Annabelle's, he couldn't believe it when she said yes. "I'll buy a ring tomorrow," he said, trying not to think about the parlous state of his bank account, which had turned a deeper shade of red since he'd met Arabella. "Why bother to buy one when you can steal the best there is?" she said. Jeremy burst out laughing, but it quickly became clear Arabella wasn't joking. That was the moment he should have walked away, but he realized he couldn't if it meant losing her. He knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with this beautiful and intoxicating woman, and if stealing a ring was what it took, it seemed a small price to pay. "What type shall I steal?" he asked, still not altogether sure that she was serious. "The expensive type," she replied. "In fact, I've already chosen the one I want." She passed him a De Beers catalogue. "Page 43, she said. "It's called the Candice Diamond." "But have you worked out how I'm going to steal it?" asked Jeremy, studying a photograph of the faultless yellow diamond. "Oh, that's the easy part, darling," she said. "All you have to do is follow my instructions." Jeremy didn't say a word until she'd finished outlining her plan. That's how he had ended up in the Ritz that morning, wearing his only tailored suit, a pair of Lynx cufflinks, a Cartier tank watch, and an old Etonian tie, all of which belonged to Arabella's father. "I'll have to return everything by tonight," she said. "Otherwise Pa might miss them and start asking questions." "Of course," said Jeremy, who was enjoying becoming acquainted with the trappings of the rich, even if it was only a fleeting acquaintance. The waiter returned, carrying a silver tray. Neither of them spoke as he placed a cup of mint tea in front of Arabella and a pot of coffee on Jeremy's side of the table. "Will there be anything else, sir?" "No, thank you," said Jeremy, with an assurance he'd acquired during the past month. "Do you think you're ready?" asked Arabella, her knee brushing against the inside of his leg, while she once again gave him the smile that had so captivated him at Ascot. "I'm ready," said Jeremy, trying to sound convincing. "Good. I'll wait here until you return, darling." That same smile. "You know how much this means to me."